God is a name for the highest level of consciousness. Alan Watts. What if the most radical, dangerous idea in human history isn't that God doesn't exist, but that God is closer than your next breath? Last night, I found myself on my knees, not in prayer exactly, but in that strange space where questions become so heavy, they physically pull you down. Blood pounding in my ears, hands shaking, the kind of existential vertigo that feels like falling through the floor. I was thinking about all those moments people describe meeting God, those profound experiences of presence, of being seen by something greater. And suddenly, a terrible thought crept in. What if in every sacred text, every mystical encounter, every divine revelation throughout history, it wasn't God reaching down to us, but consciousness reaching up to itself? What if God is you? Not metaphorically, not poetically, but literally. What if what we call the divine is actually consciousness itself, experiencing parts of itself it doesn't recognize as itself? I'm Alexander Gray. This is Vertigo. The religious would call this blasphemy. The atheists would call it psychology. But what if they're both missing something far more unsettling? The eye with which I see God is the same eye with which God sees me. Meister Eckhart. Have you ever noticed how strangely familiar God seems to be to those who claim to know him best? The ancient Greeks, with their passionate, jealous gods, hurling thunderbolts and seducing mortals, they were a reflection of the Greeks themselves, weren't they? And the stern, law-giving God of the early Hebrews. He emerged from a people desperate for order in a chaotic world. It's always struck me as peculiar, how perfectly God seems to match the consciousness of whoever's worshiping, almost as if we're not discovering something external at all, but encountering our own reflection in the deepest mirror. I remember when I was 19, alone in my university chapel at 2 a.m., I had this overwhelming sense of presence, something vast, something knowing, something that seemed to hold me in perfect understanding. I called it God then. I was so certain it was coming from elsewhere, from beyond. But now I'm haunted by how that presence felt exactly like a deeper version of myself, like I was finally seeing with eyes I didn't know I had. Here's what keeps me awake at night: every culture's concept of the divine. It evolves precisely as human consciousness evolves. Medieval minds imagined a medieval God. Renaissance minds, a Renaissance God. Modern minds, a modern God. It's like watching humanity grow up through its concept of divinity. Or maybe it's watching consciousness slowly recognizing itself. The strangest part? The mystics. The ones who go deepest into religious experience. They keep telling us this very thing. Before we silence them for heresy, Eckhart knew it. The eye with which I see God is the same eye with which God sees me. It's not poetry. It's the most literal description of what happens when consciousness recognizes itself. And that's where the first vertigo hits you. What if what we're praying to is actually what's doing the praying? What if divinity isn't reaching down to us, but reaching up to itself through us? When we speak to God, who exactly is speaking to whom? If you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him. Zen koan. There's something deeply uncomfortable about what we're considering here. That's why I was pacing all night. Because if God is consciousness experiencing itself, then we're all engaged in the strangest kind of psychological projection. It's like we create God in our image, and then forget we've done so, and then let the image rule over us. Do you see how bizarre that is? It's like a cosmic version of what psychologists call projection. I keep thinking about what Carl Jung wrote about this. He called it the projection of the self-archetype. But I wonder if he went far enough. It's not just that we're projecting aspects of ourselves onto a concept of God. It's that what we're calling God might be just consciousness, folding back on itself, creating the ultimate mirror. Alan Watts talked about this as the cosmic game of hide and seek, where the universe plays by pretending to be many separate things, when it's actually one thing experiencing itself from countless perspectives. He said something that haunts me. God is what happens when you say, I, and don't know what you're talking about. And every time I think I understand that, it slips away again. The Zen Buddhists understood this, hence that disturbing koan. If you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him. It's not advocating violence. It's warning against mistaking the symbol for what it symbolizes. The finger for the moon. Your concept of the divine, for the divine itself. But here's where the terror creeps in. What if there is no elsewhere for God to exist? What if heaven isn't up there, but in here? What if we've been building elaborate external structures, cathedrals and temples, creeds and commandments, to house what was always internal? Think about it. Religious institutions serve a strange purpose, don't they? They externalize and formalize something that might originally have been a direct experience of consciousness. They create intermediaries between you and, well, you. And that's the second vertigo. The realization that what we've been calling God might be nothing more than consciousness, elevated to its highest level. But that doesn't make it less divine. It might make it more divine, because it means the sacred isn't elsewhere. It's not behind clouds or beyond death. It's right here, in the miracle of awareness itself, in the inexplicable fact that the universe, somehow, knows that it exists. But if that's true, then all our praying, all our worshiping, all our religious structures, they're not really about connecting to something outside us. They're elaborate systems designed to help consciousness recognize itself. And that is far more unsettling than any crisis of faith. The kingdom of God is within you. Luke 17:21. You know what's actually funny about all this? If I told my grandmother what we're discussing right now, she'd just shrug and say, "Of course God is inside you. That's what I've been telling you since you were 5. The wisdom of simple faith sometimes cuts through all our philosophical knots, doesn't it? While intellectuals debate the nature of consciousness, children intuitively sense the divine in themselves and everything around them. There's something beautiful in that, something I sometimes miss in all my late-night existential wrestling matches. But then again, there's a reason we don't stop at children's understanding. It's strange, isn't it, how the mystical traditions across every major religion, they keep hinting at this uncomfortable truth, as if they've all glimpsed the same thing, but described it through different cultural lenses. The Sufis with their concept of Wahdat al-Wujud, unity of being, the Advaita Vedanta tradition with Tat Tvam Asi, thou art that, the Kabbalah with Ein Sof flowing through all creation, Christ saying the kingdom is within, Buddha pointing to the enlightened mind. They're all saying the same thing, in different languages, with different symbols. But we've been trained to focus on the differences, haven't we? To build walls between traditions, when maybe they're all maps to the same territory. Consider what happens in the brain during profound spiritual experiences. Neuroscientists have started studying this. People in deep meditation, in prayer, in mystical states. The default mode network quiets down, the part of the brain that maintains the sense of a separate self. And suddenly, the boundaries dissolve. The sense of being a separate you falls away, and people report feeling connected to everything, to a vast presence, to God. But I'm beginning to suspect that it isn't connection to something external at all. What if it's consciousness, finally experiencing itself without the illusion of separation, without the borders and boundaries it usually maintains? Prayer becomes something completely different in this light, doesn't it? Not a conversation between you and someone else, but a dialogue between different layers of your own consciousness, the surface mind, speaking to the depths, and the depths answering in that strange other voice we've called divine. Meditation 2. It's not about connecting to something external, but about removing the barriers that make consciousness forget its own true nature. When I was younger, I used to pray every night, waiting for that sense of presence, of being heard, and sometimes it would come, that feeling of vast acceptance, limitless understanding, perfect love. And I called it God. But what if what I was experiencing was consciousness without its usual constraints, my own depths, that I couldn't recognize as myself? There's something both liberating and terrifying in this realization. The comfort of realizing you are what you've been seeking, but also the responsibility, because if God is consciousness, and consciousness is you, there's nowhere to place the burden of meaning, of morality, of purpose, no divine father figure to approve or condemn, just you, all of you. The you that's so much greater than you ever imagined. And I don't know if we're ready for that. I don't know if I'm ready for that. Because if it's true, if what we've been calling God is actually consciousness itself, then heaven isn't somewhere else. It's the mind, experiencing itself fully. Hell isn't somewhere else either. It's consciousness trapped in the illusion of separation. And salvation isn't something given from above. It's the recognition of what's always been true. You are what you've been seeking all along. Man is something that shall be overcome. What have you done to overcome him? Friedrich Nietzsche. You know what's strange? The more I consider this idea, that God is consciousness, the more I realize why it's been resisted so fiercely throughout history. If God is elsewhere, distant, separate, then religious institutions become necessary, don't they? They become the intermediaries, the bridge builders, between humanity and divinity. They get to interpret, to translate, to control access. But if God is consciousness itself, if the divine isn't distant but immediate, present in every moment of awareness, then suddenly, the entire power structure collapses. This is what Nietzsche was getting at, I think. Not that God had literally died, but that our concept of God as something separate from ourselves was dying, and he saw the vertigo that would follow. The existential crisis when we can no longer place the burden of meaning on something external. The traditional religious perspective would call all of this heresy, of course. God created man in his image, not the other way around. The ontological separation between creator and created is foundational to most Western religious thought. God is transcendent, wholly other, perfect in ways we can never be. To conflate human consciousness with the divine isn't just incorrect in this view. It's the original sin. Eating the forbidden fruit because we wanted to be like God. And they have a point, don't they? There's something presumptuous about this entire premise. Something that feels almost like cosmic arrogance. Who am I to claim that what moves through me is the same as what created the universe? Yet the mystics within these same traditions keep hinting otherwise. The religious authorities have always resisted this idea. When mystics get too close to saying God is you, they get silenced. Eckhart was condemned. The Sufis were persecuted. The Gnostics were declared heretical. Even within Buddhism, the most radical non-theistic traditions, those who took "you are the Buddha" too literally faced resistance. But here's what's truly provocative. The secular authorities resist it too, don't they? Consciousness is merely brain function. Mind is merely matter. The reduction of awareness to neurons firing. It's a different kind of externalization, but it serves the same purpose, keeping the divine at bay, keeping consciousness small. Because if consciousness is just a byproduct of brain activity, if awareness is just an evolutionary accident, then we're off the hook, aren't we? We don't have to face the terrifying responsibility of being whatever it is we actually are. And modern neuroscience would dismiss this entire conversation as meaningless. Consciousness is just what brains do. There's nothing mysterious about it. I attended a lecture last month where a prominent neurologist displayed colorful brain scans while explaining how every spiritual experience, every moment of transcendence, could be mapped to specific neural activity. When you stimulate the temporal lobe just so, he demonstrated with a pointer, you can reliably induce the feeling of a divine presence. It's just electrochemistry. He was so certain, so dismissive of any deeper interpretation, and there was something compelling in the simplicity of it. No cosmic mystery, no divine paradox, just neurons firing in patterns shaped by evolution. But that explanation has always felt insufficient to me, like describing a symphony as just air vibrating, or a novel as just ink on paper. Technically true, but missing everything that matters. I need to tell you what really happened last week. It wasn't just reading Pascal. I was on the floor of my bathroom at 3 a.m. Couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The weight of everything had finally crushed me. Because if this is true, if God is consciousness experiencing itself, then there's nowhere to hide anymore. No one to absolve me, no one to save me, no cosmic parent to tell me it's going to be okay. I've spent my life studying these ideas, wrestling with these questions. But that night, it wasn't philosophical anymore. It was terror, pure existential terror. Do you understand what I'm saying? If consciousness is divine, then we are both the source of all meaning and the ones desperate for meaning. We are both the ones crying out in the dark and the only ones who can answer. We're completely alone and completely connected at the same time. I don't know if anyone is ready for that responsibility. I don't know if I am. We can't say God works in mysterious ways anymore. We can't outsource moral responsibility. We can't appeal to divine plans to explain suffering. We have to face the fact that consciousness, our consciousness, yours and mine, is the source, the witness, the experiencer of everything. And that's overwhelming. That's why I was on my knees that night, not praying to something else, but buckling under the weight of what we might actually be. But then, there's suffering, isn't there? The child with cancer, the tsunami that kills thousands, the senseless cruelty humans inflict on each other. If God is consciousness, if divinity is what we are, then who's responsible for all this pain? It can't be blamed on some distant deity's mysterious plan anymore. I was speaking with a mother who lost her daughter last year. She found comfort in believing it was God's will, that some higher wisdom knew why this had to happen. But if what we're saying is true, then what? That consciousness itself, that she herself on some level participated in this loss? That's not just philosophically challenging, it's emotionally devastating. This might be why we created the separation in the first place, to have somewhere to direct our anger, someone to blame, someone to plead with, because the alternative, that suffering, is woven into the fabric of consciousness itself. That's almost unbearable to consider. If God is you, truly you, not metaphorically, not poetically, but literally, where does meaning come from? Where does purpose come from? Where does good and evil come from? It can't come from above anymore. It has to come from within. From consciousness recognizing its own nature. And that might be the last blasphemy. Not denying God exists, but recognizing where God has been all along, inside. Do you see what's happening here? Do you see the magnitude of this? Every prayer ever spoken, every cathedral ever built, every holy war ever fought, every moment of religious ecstasy, every cry for divine help. It's all been consciousness talking to itself. It's all been the universe trying to remember what it is. My God. My God. The word revelation doesn't seem big enough for this. It's not that there is no God. It's that what God is, what God has always been, is so much more intimate, so much more immediate than we ever dared to imagine. There is a light that shines beyond all things on earth, beyond the highest, the very highest heavens. This is the light that shines in your heart. Chandogya Upanishad. Maybe we've been thinking about this in the wrong way all along. When I first had this thought that God might be consciousness itself, I saw it as either a reduction, God reduced to psychology, or an elevation, consciousness elevated to divinity. But what if it's neither? What if the whole framework of separation is the illusion? The mystics point to something beyond both the religious illusion that God is separate and the materialist illusion that consciousness is merely brain function. They point to something that transcends that entire duality. Think about light. When physicists study it, sometimes it behaves as a particle, sometimes as a wave. The nature of light transcends our categories. It exists in a way that our divided mind struggles to grasp. What if consciousness, what if God is like that? Neither just out there, nor just in here, but a reality that transcends that very distinction. The Upanishads say, Aham Brahmasmi, I am Brahman. Not because the ego is God, but because when you go deep enough into what you are, you find something that can no longer be called yours, something that belongs to existence itself. Last night, I was sitting here 4 a.m., everything quiet, and suddenly, the question of whether God is me or not me just dissolved. It wasn't that I had an answer. It was that I saw the question itself was based on a distinction that might not actually exist. It was like realizing I'd been arguing about whether the reflection in the mirror was me or not me, when the whole framing missed the point entirely. Because consciousness isn't something you have, it's what you are. And it's not just what you are, it's what everything is. The universe experiencing itself, from countless perspectives, through countless forms. And if that's the case, then recognizing yourself as an expression of the divine consciousness doesn't change anything externally. The dishes still need washing. Work still needs doing. People still suffer. Life remains exactly what it was. And yet, everything changes because you're no longer a separate entity, living in a dead universe, praying to a distant God. Your consciousness itself, taking form, playing its part in the cosmic drama, while always connected to the whole. The vertigo comes from recognizing you are both creator and created, observer and observed, the one who prays and what is prayed to. Not because your ego is God, but because both you and God are expressions of the same consciousness. And perhaps that's what all the prophets, all the mystics, all the sages have been trying to tell us. In their different languages, through their different symbols. Not that God is elsewhere, not that God is you, but that the very distinction between you and not you, between here and there, between human and divine, that's the illusion. The peace comes when we stop trying to resolve the paradox and instead live within it, when we honor both the wave and the ocean, the form and what it expresses, the human and the divine. So, is God you? Yes and no, and something beyond both yes and no. The question isn't meant to be answered, it's meant to be lived. And perhaps that's the invitation in all of this, not to settle on a new belief, but to live in the tension of the question, to allow consciousness to recognize itself in you, as you, through you. And in that recognition, maybe that's where the divine truly lives. I've been sitting here for hours now, wrestling with this idea, this possibility that what we've been calling God has been our own deepest consciousness all along. There's something both liberating and terrifying in it, isn't there? The thought that divinity isn't distant but immediate. Not something to be found, but something that's finding itself through us. The ultimate recognition. We started with Alan Watts. God is a name for the highest level of consciousness. And perhaps that's as close as words can come. But words always fall short, don't they? They create distinctions where none might exist. They separate what might be united. I keep coming back to that moment in the chapel, years ago. That overwhelming sense of presence, of being seen, known, held. I called it God, then. What do I call it now? Maybe the name doesn't matter. Maybe what matters is the recognition itself. The moments when consciousness touches its own depths. When the apparent separation dissolves, even if just for a breath. And perhaps that's the real invitation in all of this. Not to trade one belief for another. Not to decide once and for all if God is you or not. But to live in the fertile ground of the question itself. To allow it to transform how you experience everything. Because if consciousness is divine, if awareness itself is sacred, then every moment of being alive, of being aware, is a holy moment. Every act of attention becomes a form of prayer. Every experience of connection becomes a taste of what religions have called God. And maybe that's enough. Not answers, but better questions. Not certainty, but more alive uncertainty. Not beliefs about what God is, but direct experience of what being conscious means. I don't know if I've found clarity or just better confusion tonight, but somehow, that feels right. Because whatever consciousness is, whatever God is, it's surely beyond our categories, beyond our understanding, beyond the very distinction between you and other that creates the question in the first place. I'm Alexander Gray, and this has been Vertigo. Thank you for thinking with me. And wherever you go from here, remember, the eye with which you see might be the very eye that sees you back.